Hello, friends. Pastor Chester Hitchcock here. Today we're going to talk about the issue of, does God set up all of the rulers and take them down? In other words, regardless of who we vote for, is God ultimately the one who's going to set up the rulers and take them down, and our vote really doesn't matter? Well, let's examine the Bible verses on this topic to answer that question. You know, there are many Christians who refuse to complain or criticize any government leader because they believe that to do so is to go against the Word of God, and I respect and appreciate that. The primary verses that they rest their view on is Romans chapter 13, verse 1, and Daniel chapter 2, verse 20. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 from the New American Standard Bible reads like this: "Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God." And Daniel chapter 2 verse 20 says, "He, that is God, removes kings and raises up kings." It seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Let's look at other examples. Here is Hosea chapter 8 verse 4 from the New American Standard Bible. Quote, "They have set up kings, but not by me. They have appointed princes, but I did not know it. With their silver and gold they have made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off." End quote. How do we understand these verses together in a way that they do not contradict one another? Well, let's examine Romans chapter 13, verse 1 first. The key to this verse is the part that says that there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. There are two words in this verse that must be examined. The first is the word authority, which is the Greek word exousios. It refers to anyone who has power or can exercise authority, and in this context of Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, it is referring to the government authority. Then you have the Greek word that is translated established, or it is the Greek word tassos. This word appears 8 times in the New Testament: Matthew chapter 28, verse 16, Luke 7, verse 8, Acts 13, verse 48, Acts 15, verse 2, Acts 22, verse 10, Acts 28, verse 23, and of course here in Romans chapter 13, verse 1, and 1 Corinthians 16, 15. The word means to appoint or to use. Romans chapter 9, verse 17 reminds us that God put Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, in his position and in his authority, and Pharaoh was, according to Exodus chapters 7 through 11, was an evil ruler. Furthermore, Exodus chapter 9, verse 16, God said this to Pharaoh: "For this very purpose I raised you up to demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth." There are other examples, such as John chapter 19, verse 11, where Jesus told Pontius Pilate, who was an evil governor, that his authority came from God the Father. Daniel chapter 4 records King Nebuchadnezzar having a dream that God gave him, and he was an evil ruler. Listen to what Daniel chapter 4 verse 17 says from the New King James Version. It says, quote, "This decision is by decree of the angelic watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High Ruler in the kingdom of men gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men." Again, it seems clear that it is God who ultimately sets up rulers and takes them down. So where does our vote count, or does it even count at all ultimately? Well, we're still left with the words that are found in Hosea. Are there any other places similar to Hosea that suggest that God actually allows nations to select their own rulers? Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 7, we're told that the nation of Israel had rejected God as their king. Verse 7 summarizes Israel's request. The Lord said to Samuel, quote, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." The result was that God allowed Israel to select or to elect their own king. Verses 10 through 18 records what God told Samuel to tell Israel of what they would experience with their new king. The entire description is negative, and verse 18 reads like this, quote, "They will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." The message to Israel was simple. They would be allowed to select their own ruler, but it would not be the ruler that God wanted for them. The ruler would be an evil one who would oppress them. Yet God would use them and establish their throne, but it would not be God's choice. Later in Hosea chapter 13, verses 9 through 11, God rebukes Israel for rejecting him as their king. Listen to these stark words, quote, "It is your destruction, O Israel, that you are against me, against your help. Where now is your king, that he may save you in all your cities and your judges of whom you requested? Give me a king and princes. I gave you a king in my anger and took him away in my wrath." King Saul proved to be an evil king. Most of the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah were evil kings. The people of Israel, or the leaders of Israel, selected their king. He allowed their choice. He granted these men the authority to rule over them as kings, though it was not to the benefit of Israel and Judah. How should we understand Hosea chapter 8, verse 4? Listen to it again, beginning with verse 2. "They cry out to me, 'My God, we of Israel know you.' Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue him. They have set up kings, but not by me. They have appointed princes, but I did not know it. With their silver and gold they have made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off." The answer is that just as Israel rejected God as their king in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 18, yet God granted their choice, God repeatedly used their horrible choices of kings. And this clears up any contradiction between Romans chapter 13, verse 1 and Hosea 8, verse 4. According to Romans chapter 13, verse 1, God will grant them authority. Even though man chose the wrong ones, God would grant them authority. He would use them. He would establish them. He would give them the authority. But according to Hosea chapter 8, verse 4, just because they are leaders doesn't mean that it is God's choice. It is quite possible for us to elect an evil leader against God's will. In so doing, we, like Israel, might learn from our mistakes the hard way. If we select or elect someone who doesn't reflect a godly character, regardless of whether they might have problems in their lives, do they reflect a godly character? Romans chapter 13, verse 4 gives us the purpose of government and of rulers. It says that they are appointed by God, that is, governments and rulers are appointed by God to suppress evil and to keep evil in check. When they failed to do this, it was harmful to the people that they led, as it is true today. Let's be clear. God has not established human governments for the purpose of Christianizing the world. Again, the purpose of government is to suppress evil and to maintain some semblance of justice and care for the oppressed. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17 says, "Learn to do good, seek justice, reprove the oppressor, defend the fatherless, and plead for the widow." Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17 describes the rebuke of the nation of Israel for selecting, that is, electing, an evil king. In conclusion, let me say that Jesus led groups that numbered into the thousands with words that angered both the religious and the political leaders of Israel, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Those protests were peaceful, but they didn't stop the leaders from repeatedly trying to arrest Jesus. Jesus upset the leaders to the point that they finally led a brutal group of law officers to arrest him. When Peter resorted to violence, Jesus corrected him, but the officers still took Jesus by force and had him interrogated and eventually crucified. Peaceful protests, violent protests, and even police brutality were all issues that were addressed in the arrest of Jesus. As we navigate through this highly charged political time in our history, let us always be willing to learn from that event. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Also, write me a comment in the comment section. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, click on that subscribe button, ring the bell, and choose all so that you can be sure to get the next video that is published. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.